that localization is, especially for B2B SaaS companies, is a growth lever, is something that they can use to grow in a way that is agile and doesn't necessarily require a huge investment upfront to test new markets.
Welcome to the Multilingual Content Podcast, where experts discuss international content management, product localization, and global expansion. I'm Caterina from Undertow, and today we are bringing you an insightful conversation between our founder, Nicola Calabrese, and Marco Airoldi, our CEO and co-founder at Undertow. Together, they will explore how B2B SaaS can master localization through strategic planning, advanced technology, and streamlining operational processes. So before we begin, I'd like to share with you a quick update. We'll be taking a short break over the holidays, so our next episode will be available on January 13th. Make sure to subscribe to stay up to date. And with that, let's dive in.
Today, I'm here with Marco Airoldi. He's co-founder and operations director at Undertow, and we're going to talk about the importance of localization for B2B SaaS companies. Welcome, Marco, to the Multilingual Content Podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here finally. Yeah, so as Nicola was saying, we're going to be talking about mainly three areas. And I would say it makes sense to divide the discussion in three parts. So first, we're going to be talking about localization governance. So everything that a company needs to do from the point of view of strategic localization. So putting in place a localization strategy and then putting in place metrics to track how this strategy is being executed. Then we're going to be talking about the localization execution, which is all the processes on how to execute that strategy. And then so that comes into processes, workflows, all of these things to optimize how the efforts are carried out. And then we're going to be talking about talent and process alignment, which is basically that everyone within the company is aware of localization. Everyone knows what the processes are and how they fit into the wider goals of the business. So I would say if we want to start with strategy, I think the best person to talk about this would be Nico. So when we talk about strategy, we often say that the localization strategy needs to be aligned with the overall business strategy. So how do we go about that? How do we prioritize, for example, different markets for a certain business? And how do we establish the factors that are important to be considered when establishing these priorities?
So there are different factors to take into consideration when going international. And first of all, the company needs to align the localization strategy with the growth targets. That means how much they are planning to grow over the course of years. And that means also like looking at the market maturity of different markets where they're entering in, because the product that you're offering might not be a category that is well known in some specific markets, while you might have other markets where you already have competitors in there. So it's things to take into consideration. On one hand, you might enter a market where there's no competitors, so it might be fairly easy, but you need to educate your potential customers on why your product is useful. And on the other hand, there might be other markets where you already have local competitors or other international companies already there. So you have to take into account the strategy around that. And the last but not least is looking at customer demand. For example, even if your product, your app is still in English, you might see like users signing up in different parts of the world. And that even like a small percentage of people signing up in a different country might be a signal that it might make sense to consider that market to expand into that. But then you got to have to look at also the logistics of that. For example, depending on your sales strategy, if it relies on it's a product-led strategy, or if maybe it's a sales-led strategy. So in that case, you will need like salespeople in the country or working from the headquarters targeting the country. So there's different aspects to take into account. And it's not just, don't just look for the biggest market. For example, a lot of companies think about Germany straight off the bat in Europe, but it's not necessarily the best market to enter into because there's different, depending on the vertical you're in, the kind of approach you have. And there are examples of companies setting up an office in Germany, putting a lot of effort there and then realizing it's not a great market. And they spent a lot of money and resources there and they have to basically backtrack. And while maybe next door, they got France, they didn't think it was a great market. And actually it turns out is really interested in your solution. There's not much competition there. Your message resonates quite a lot. So it's something to take into consideration when you decide which markets to prioritize and to enter into.
Yeah, I think that's quite a good point. And I think one thing that I would add from that point of view, it's also that another tool that we can use to help with the strategy is the analytics, because there are analytic tools that once we've done a basic localization of some main elements for a certain market, then we can evaluate the response. So for example, if we see that by having translated a certain app or a certain product into a particular language for, let's say, the German market or the French market, then we see that there is a considerable increase in the downloads and the user adoption in that market, then we can see how important the translation is for that market. So there might be two markets where we've carried out the same translation or transcreation or localization efforts, and then we would have very different responses, because one market would be very used to actually using products of similar nature in English, whereas the other market would be very focused on using them in their localized language. So we can take that data and then combine it with the overall strategy of the business, so how important that specific market would be for the business, and then reassess the strategy. So decide to increase the localization effort for that particular market or reduce them or stop where we are, for example.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, like, you have to keep an eye on specific metrics. So the first step will be to define relevant metrics for the different parts of the experience. So for example, if you're looking at the website, maybe you're going to look at the amount of visitors that you get after localizing a web page, the bounce rate there, the conversion rate. And then you go maybe in the product side, you will see like how the user adoption, customer satisfaction, and like the churn rate that you might get there. And from support, you might measure like tickets. For example, imagine before you had your help center in English, you had a certain amount of tickets. Then you start localizing at least the most important pages of the help center. And then you see a difference in ticketing that also shows the value added by localization. But that helps as well before that, when you want to establish a budget, looking at the potential of different markets. Not all the markets are the same. Like there's might be more potential in some markets and less potential in other. Taking into account what I was saying before about how complicated a market is to enter. For example, if there's a lot of competition, maybe you need to go a little bit more deep, do more partnerships to break into the market. So take that into consideration when you decide and establish how much you want to invest in a specific market for localization, because it's true that it might be more complicated, but it might be much more potential there than in other markets. So consider that and do a market by market approach, and then put it together and keep in mind also always to leave like some leeway for like out of scope projects that might pop up throughout the year. But the other part that we would like to talk about today is the localization execution. When it comes to managing content for localization, how do we decide what should be prioritized?
Okay, so I think the most important thing is, first of all, to establish that priority is not something that is written in stone, but more than anything is something that is multi-layered. So a lot of times companies would consider a priority as an element of their product, a priority. So let's say they would say, the first thing that we need to do to be able to enter a market is to translate the website, or the first thing is to localize the app. I think reasoning like thinking by blocks doesn't really work, because what we need to consider is, for example, we translate the website, or we do some marketing, we do a marketing campaign for a specific market, for France, let's say. We get some interested users that are ready to buy our product in France. Then the moment they start actually looking into downloading the app, using it, they realize that the app is not available in French. So that's a big problem, because we had the potential customer and then we lost it because the product is not localized. So what we think is the best way to go about it is to actually establish a base layer on all these blocks. So let's say the landing page of the website, the most important feature pages of the website. Then maybe we don't bother with the blog for now. We're going to leave it for a later stage. Then we localize the app, but maybe we don't localize everything in the app. We don't localize all the functions. We localize the main ones so that the user can have a full experience, but not of all the features. And then when we're talking about support, for example, we would have the help articles. We would localize the ones that have the most traffic. So the ones that in English receive the most visits, then we might localize 5, 6, 10. We start from those, and then based on how they get visited, then the intention is to localize more, both for the website, the blog, the features of the app, and the help center. So all of these, we start from a basic layer, let's say, and then we expand it based on the response. Because sometimes we would have carried out the same localization efforts for 3 markets, let's say, to have this base layer. We enter all these markets and we see one market responds much better than the other 2. So maybe for those 2, we're going to keep it as it is. Whereas for this third market that is responding very well, we're going to increase the localization effort to allow users to have more functionalities, to have more help center articles translated. We might consider translating the blog. We might do some more marketing outreach efforts, some more marketing campaigns to get more users because we see that they respond. So that actually can mean that localization itself can provide data for business development, because we localize the app or the product in a certain market, and we enter that market, and then we find out things that we didn't find out about that market before we localized. As we were talking about before, about the market being very specific about having a product in their own language. Some markets are like that. So the moment you don't localize, your product might be the best product ever, but you're never going to be successful in that market.
I agree. And then when working on the translations, it's best to use some system and some platform to manage everything, because doing everything in Excel or in Google Docs attached to emails, that's not the best way to go about it. So usually what we recommend is using what is called a translation management system. That's a platform where you can carry out the translations, you can connect it with your string repository and your CMS. And he is going to keep also like a database of all the translations you do that you can reference back and leverage when you do like updates or related projects. You can have glossaries in there and automated quality controls as well. And it also includes like some workflow automation to streamline the managing of the different tasks and let's say speeding things up and taking some admin out of the picture. But you mentioned one of the things that is cultural relevance. So I have a question about you. How do you ensure content is culturally relevant and of high quality?
Okay, so I think first of all, this might sound obvious to you and to some of our listeners as well. I think we have to differentiate between translation and adaptation. So because adaptation doesn't goes far beyond translation, because as you were saying, it takes into account the customs of the target culture. There's the cultural relevance of what we're doing, but also the cultural appropriateness of what we're doing, of the language that we're speaking. So for example, this might be as obvious as using the formal versus the informal address. So let's say in English, it's quite common that an app would use the informal you, but this might not be appropriate in other languages. And this applies to all levels of communication because, for example, it applies to UI. If we think about, let's say, buttons. So buttons in English normally use the imperative, contact, confirm, something like that. This would be the same, for example, in Italian, conferma, acquista, seleziona, but it would not be the same in Spanish, where instead normally apps use the infinitive, so confirmar, aceptar. So if we use the imperative in Spanish, it would sound completely irrelevant. It would sound completely out of place. And the same gets amplified the higher the visibility of the content is. So if we do a marketing campaign and then we use the wrong tone of voice and we address people in a way that doesn't resonate, then the efficacy of that, the effectiveness of that marketing campaign is going to be completely destroyed by this misalignment, let's say. And also from the point of view of the selection of content. So let's say if we have a blog post that talks very specifically about some local regulations that are very radicated into the home market. So let's say the company is based in the States and we have a blog post that talks about some regulations that are very US specific. Then translating that blog post doesn't really make any sense because it could be the best translation, but it's just the information that is included in that blog post is not relevant for a user in Germany, in France. So it might be better either to skip that blog completely or to create a similar blog, but that has information that are relevant for the German market or for the French market, or have the blog itself stays the same, but that there are parts that we completely rewrite according to normative context of where it's going to be used, something that is relevant for our users. So this is about cultural relevancy and cultural appropriateness. Whereas when you talk about quality, I think it's important to establish a QA, a quality assurance process, a QA process for each type of content, because not all content should follow the same process. So for example, we might have some materials that require a two-step process. So we would have somebody translating it or writing the content, then somebody checking it and going feedback, sometimes even more than that. Whereas some other types of materials, like some support materials, might only require a lower level of attention to detail, let's say. And then I think that the structure behind all of this is very important. So having established terminology, glossaries that are, as you were saying, integrated in the TMS, or even just having the DMS so that we know that something has been translated in a certain way, and we can have this huge corpus of translation that has been done for this specific client, and we can go and look how this specific word, this specific sentence has been translated. But also having guidelines that are specific to the language. So most brands would have like a tone of voice guide or some guidelines that are for the brand globally. But it's also very important to have the same specific to the market, so that we take into account, as we were saying, the cultural differences, the cultural appropriateness, and the communication style for that market. And so that we can keep like a global brand, but we can have different declinations of that into the local markets. And then the last thing that I would like to mention is user feedback. So user feedback is very important, both from the point of view of the app. So as we were saying, if we have localized something and then a user comes back and says, actually, this process in the app is not really clear. So it's important to gather that feedback, encourage it actually, and then have a system to implement it, because otherwise we lose an opportunity by not doing that, because that's basically free testing, which doesn't come by very often.
Yeah, I would like to add to that technology as well is helpful when looking at making sure the quality is top notch. Because you have tools, as you mentioned, like translation memories, like the databases or previously done translations that you can refer back to. But you also have AI and other automated quality control checks that, for example, in a support center article can help you make sure that when user interface elements are mentioned, they actually mention, let's say, the right way, because there needs to be the same translation that user will actually see on the screen on the app. So the technology there, it's quite useful. And with AI, we're seeing more and more like improvements on this kind of automated checks that let's say they get more and more refined.
And there's more tools every day. It's like, actually, my next question would be, how do you pick the right tools? Like that there's so many offer for anything that you might want to do. How do you go about deciding which platform, which tools to actually implement in a specific workflow?
Yeah, that's a good question, because when you will have to look, first of all, how you're structured internally and what is your current tech stack, like what kind of pieces of software are you already using in your infrastructure. For example, the translation management system that we mentioned, it's really important that you can integrate with your CMS. For example, if you're using WordPress or Contentful, you need to make sure the translation management system that you're choosing can integrate easily with that. So you don't have to manually import and export content every time you want to translate something. And the same thing applies for the, let's say, software side of things, the product side of things. So you need to make sure not only that it integrates with your GitHub, for example, with your GitHub repository, the translation management system can connect with that, but also like how easy it is to update it. Especially, maybe you can start doing at the beginning, do things manually, but in long term, it's best to try to find a way to automatically update when there's new strings automatically being imported in the translation management system, translated over there, and then push back automatically to GitHub. So you don't have to do a lot of admin around this kind of things. And automation and integrations can make everything so much more efficient and, to be honest, like easier as well.
Yes, 100%. And I think another thing that is important from the point of view of running the process smoothly is that localization is recognized at the business level. Sometimes we have instances where localization is just an afterthought. So they sit separately from everyone else and they don't even have insight onto what's going to be on their plate soon. So they don't have visibility on what they're going to be working on. Whereas I think it's very important that localization the localization team is involved at the blending stage, and that the whole business is aware of what localization entails, what the processes are, and what the effort is required. But sometimes it's not particularly easy to do that, because how do we go about it? First of all, where does the localization team sit? Do they sit with marketing? Do they sit with product? Like sometimes there's a lot of overlap that no one knows. It's like this beast that no one actually knows how to define it, Then do you have any?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I would say, again, is to map and identify like the different pieces of localization. As you rightly mentioned, it touches so many different things, like from product marketing, and it goes to support, customer success, sales, legal. There's so many pieces. We got the technology piece, the people like the actual translators involved. So first of all, I would recommend like figuring out the owner of every single part of the localization program, because it's usually spread out at the beginning, especially. And then after that, like trying to pull people together. So engaging people from different departments, from product, marketing, customer success, put them then together, literally, if you cannot do it physically, over a video call, and discuss, like put together a plan, see where every part of the experience is and what is the next steps. So you connect dots. For example, let's say there's a new product release. So that's going to affect also marketing. That means you will need the app localized in different languages. You will need to have the campaign localized in different languages. So that's important to try to engage everybody from different departments and putting them together.
Yeah, and I think it's also sometimes important to decide what needs to be done internally and what can be outsourced, because especially in SaaS companies, in SaaS businesses, they're typically quite small. So let's say you have a lot of different tasks on the same person, that like they're wearing a lot of hats. So adding the responsibility of managing translation, or sometimes even translating the materials themselves, because sometimes SaaS businesses are quite international. So they would have some colleagues that are from different parts of the world. And then especially when that's not their job, that can take a lot of time, and it's very easy to underestimate how time consuming that is. So we find that creates a lot of bottlenecks, because then we have somebody that already has a full plate because they have a million things to do because of their job, that on top of that need to find the time to translate the strings of the app into Spanish, let's say. And that's what happens, is that it becomes the lowest of their priorities. And then it can cause delays and problems. Whereas if this was outsourced, the whole process, the whole management, then that would speed up process, because there would not be the delays, and it would actually be more manageable, because they wouldn't have to think about it. It would just be something that it's established in the process, that when it hits localization, it just goes out, and you can count on delivery times. You don't have to, like, it's out of your mind, which is sometimes we underestimate how that can really make a difference.
Yeah, I agree. And the other thing, that even though like there's all these bits and pieces, it might sound complicated to coordinate different parts of the company, product marketing, but you can have technology come in the help of it. Having some tools that allows you to have full visibility, so everybody knows what everybody else is doing regarding localization. It might be even something like as simple as an online calendar, where everybody can see the different campaigns and releases and how they are connected and at what stage they are at. These kind of things help quite a lot as well to smooth the connection between different teams.
Okay, one thing that I would like to ask you, Nicola, is how do we go about managing company growth? So let's say we start a localization program, and then 1 year down the line, 2 years down the line, we are in a completely different situation, because we have many more markets. Markets are much bigger. How do we make the process kind of growth proof, and how do we adapt to growth?
So I would say there's mostly two things to keep in mind. One is mapping, like putting together processes that you can standardize over time. So when you start small, you can start putting together a process already in mind that is going to grow. And so it needs to be scalable. So something that is repeatable, and document that, and then train people on that. So everybody's on the same page. And gradually, when you see that you get growth, training other team members and other people so they know the processes and everything's documented, it really helps speed up that process. so the process can adapt as well as the business scale, including more people and refining process more and more over time. And again, you can use technology to automate repetitive tasks and reduce friction during changes. So if you see that there's things that you do over and over and over and over, always the same, you can look into automating that. So that means maybe it's not going to be a big impact at the beginning, but once you scale, you're going to notice that what used to take like 10 minutes, if you add it up like 10 times, it's going to be 100 minutes. So if you find a way to turn that 10 minutes to 1 minute, when it's scale, it's going to be you're going to see the real benefit of that.
Yeah, that's 100% true. I don't know if there was anything else that you wanted to cover, but I think we've more or less covered everything. So maybe we can just summarize a little bit. What are the most important things that we would recommend? I think from my point of view, there's like 3 main things that we need to make sure about when we want to establish a successful localization program. And the first is, as we were saying at the beginning, the alignment between the localization strategy and the business objective. So if the business objective is to grow at a certain rate and to grow in certain markets, then we need to allocate appropriate resources and to set the right priorities. Because if we don't do that, then it's impossible to get there. And localization is actually a quite powerful tool to help us get there. The second thing, which you actually just mentioned as well, would be focused on the process, on the efficiency of the process, because you were mentioning automation and scalability, and those 2 things are incredibly closely related, because automating a process, as you were saying, if it saves you 10 seconds every time that you do it, but you do it 10,000 times a day, that's quite a big saving. And then the other thing would be to have the whole team being on the same page. So having clarity on what the localization process is, what localization is actually, and why it's important, why it's not an afterthought, and how it impacts the whole business and every initiative that the business undertakes. I don't know if you have something else to add.
No, I think that was quite comprehensive. What I would like to add is just that localization is, especially for B2B SaaS companies, is a growth lever. It's something that they can use to grow in a way that is agile and doesn't necessarily require a huge investment upfront to test new markets. And that's something that especially product-led growth company can take advantage of. And I think that's going to be more and more in the future with the evolution of technology as well. That makes a lot of things easier compared to the past. And then before closing, I would like to thank, first of all, everybody who tuned in today to listen to this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today. And if you find this helpful, I will ask you to subscribe to the podcast and to recommend it to other people if you might actually enjoy and get anything out of this, anything useful, because your contribution really does make a difference. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot for listening. Bye.
Thanks for joining us today. The Multilingual Content Podcast is powered by Undertow. We help companies translate their content into results. Get in touch if you want to know more. And if you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any new episode. See you next time.